The town was alive with noise that day, a mixture of horse hooves striking the hard ground, wagon wheels rolling over dust, and voices rising in excitement. It was market day, and people from nearby farms and ranches had come together to buy and sell goods. The sun was high, hot, and bright, throwing long shadows across the wooden buildings that lined the main street. A group of men set up a stage at the center of the square, and curiosity began to gather around them. At first, the crowd thought it was another simple auction, where a few animals and supplies would be sold. But soon whispers spread like fire. There was something unusual, something that made people laugh in disbelief. When the stage was ready, a rough-looking auctioneer stepped forward. He had a voice that carried, the kind that could command attention even over the noise of wagons and livestock. In his hand he held a wooden hammer, ready to strike it against the platform. The townsfolk leaned closer, eager to hear what was being sold. The auction began with the usual: saddles, tools, a couple of tired horses. Coins clinked, hands shot up, and deals were made. But the real stir started when the auctioneer called for silence. Letting his words drag with a cruel grin, he waved his hand toward the side of the stage, and two men pulled forward a figure that was barely standing. It was a woman, her steps unsteady, her shoulders slumped. She was clearly injured, and her clothes were torn and stained with dust. She was Apache, one of the native people, and her face carried both strength and suffering. A scar on her arm told the story of a recent wound, and her movements showed she was in pain. The crowd broke into laughter the moment they saw her, as though she was part of some cruel show rather than a human being. The auctioneer raised his hand. "Here we have something different today," he shouted. "A wounded Apache woman. What will you give for her?" His words drew even louder laughter. Some people whistled. Others jeered. The idea of a human being sold on the stage was shameful. But in that time and place, some people saw nothing wrong with it. They thought it was entertainment. Men in the crowd slapped each other on the back, throwing out small numbers just to make jokes. "She's not worth a nickel," one man shouted, and others laughed with him. Another man offered a single coin, holding it high like it was a prize, and the crowd roared. The woman stood silently, her head lowered. Her long dark hair fell across her face, hiding her eyes, but her silence carried more weight than any word could. She heard every laugh, every mocking voice, but she gave them no reaction. Though her body was weak, inside she held a strength they could not see. She had lived through battles, through loss, through pain that none of them could understand. Yet here she was, treated as if she were less than the animals they had sold before her. Her heart carried dignity, but the crowd only saw brokenness. The bidding continued, but it was not serious. Men raised their hands not to buy, but to entertain their friends. Some shouted insults instead of numbers, making the auctioneer laugh along with them. The more they mocked, the less they noticed the quiet courage of the woman standing before them. Dust swirled in the air, the hot wind carrying the sound of cruelty down the street. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, unsure why the grown-ups were laughing so loudly. For them, it was confusing to see a person treated in such a way. But the adults, caught in their own cruelty, cared only for their amusement. The auctioneer banged his hammer again. "Come now, surely she must be worth more than a coin," he shouted, pretending to be disappointed. But his smile betrayed him. He was enjoying the crowd's reaction. "She's strong even if she's wounded. Who will pay for her? Who will take her?" His words only sparked more laughter. Men joked about how useless she would be, how she would not last a week. Each cruel comment made her seem smaller in their eyes, but not in her own. Beneath her lowered gaze, her mind was strong. She did not speak, but she remembered every face that laughed, every voice that insulted. The square grew louder, the crowd pressing closer. Some people shook their heads, not out of pity for the woman, but because they thought the whole thing was ridiculous. Others shouted louder, their voices filling the hot air with careless cruelty. A few women in the crowd looked at the Apache woman with sadness, but they too said nothing. In those moments, silence felt safer than speaking against the laughter of many. The woman stood there, her hands bound loosely, her body leaning slightly to one side. Her breathing was heavy, but she refused to collapse. If she fell, she knew the crowd would only laugh harder. She forced herself to remain standing, even when her legs shook beneath her. The sun beat down, making the moment even more unbearable. Sweat rolled down her forehead, mixing with the dust on her face. The auctioneer waved his hammer again, calling out for higher bids, but the numbers remained low and insulting. 2 coins, someone shouted, and the crowd roared with laughter as though it was the funniest thing they had heard all week. The woman lifted her head just slightly, her dark eyes scanning the crowd for a moment. She saw not kindness, not compassion, but faces twisted in mockery, and yet within her a spark remained alive. They could laugh all they wanted, but they could not take away her spirit. The market day that had begun like any other had turned into a cruel show. Every word, every laugh seemed designed to strip away her dignity, but the Apache woman held herself as steady as she could. She knew she was more than what they said. She was a daughter, perhaps a mother, perhaps a sister, someone with stories, memories, and dreams. They did not see it, but it was there. She carried with her the weight of her people, their history, and their strength. Her silence was not weakness. It was defiance in the face of humiliation. As the auctioneer shouted for another bid, the laughter rose again, louder than before. The sound echoed off the wooden buildings, filling the air with cruelty. The wounded woman remained in her place alone against the jeering crowd. No one could have guessed then that this moment, this cruel laughter would soon turn into silence. No one imagined that the arrival of a single cowboy would change the course of the day. But for now in that square, all that could be heard was laughter, and all that could be seen was a wounded woman standing tall in her own quiet strength. The crowd did not grow kinder as the bidding dragged on. If anything, their laughter grew sharper, their words crueler. The auctioneer, noticing how the numbers remained low, tried to stir excitement. He clapped his hands and shouted, telling the men that surely they could do better than a single coin or two. He asked if there was no one among them willing to show he had pride, no one brave enough to outbid the last offer. His voice rose, but still the bids were a joke. It was clear that the wounded Apache woman was nothing but a target for the town's scorn. One man near the front leaned on the edge of the stage, his hat tilted back as he grinned. He tossed a coin into the air and caught it, saying loudly that this was all she was worth to him. Another laughed so hard that he bent over, slapping his knees, saying she would not even last to cook a meal. The auctioneer played along, pretending to argue, but the smirk on his face betrayed the truth. He enjoyed the mockery as much as they did. He was not running an honest auction, he was fueling a spectacle. The woman did not move. She kept her head slightly lowered, her long dark hair hiding her face. Yet the small tremor in her shoulders showed she was aware of every word. Inside her, a storm of feelings moved, shame, anger, and sorrow, but she buried them deep. Her people had taught her endurance. Even in pain, even in humiliation, she would not cry before them. Her silence unsettled a few in the back of the crowd. It was as if she carried a secret strength that made her stand straighter than the cruel voices deserved. Children peered from behind their parents' legs, confused. They did not understand why a person was being sold like an old wagon or a sick horse. A little boy tugged at his father's sleeve, asking in a soft voice why people were laughing. The father gave no answer, only shushed him and looked away. The laughter was easier to join than to question, and so he remained silent. The auctioneer banged his hammer against the stage again, his voice rising. "Come now. She has strong arms, even if wounded. Look at her. She can work if given the chance. What say you? 3 coins, 4? His tone shifted between playful and mocking, and the crowd responded in kind. Someone shouted from the back that even 4 coins were too much. A burst of laughter rolled through the square, shaking the air like a wave. The woman swayed slightly where she stood, but she steadied herself, refusing to fall. Minutes turned into long moments, and still no serious bids came. The townsfolk were not there to buy. They were there to entertain themselves. Each insult made them laugh harder, and each laugh made the woman's silence heavier. Some began to throw out ridiculous numbers, not higher bids, but lower, almost to make a game of it. "A single nail," one called out.
"Half a loaf of bread,"
another shouted, and the crowd erupted once more. The woman closed her eyes for a brief second. In that stillness, she remembered faces that gave her strength, her family, her people, her land. She remembered the songs that once carried across campfires at night, the way children laughed when playing in the grass, the way elders told stories of endurance. They had taught her that dignity was not in what others gave you, but in what you carried within yourself. Their laughter could strip away her freedom, her safety, her comfort, but they could not take the strength she held inside. Around her, the town square grew restless. The sun pressed down, baking the ground, and sweat formed on foreheads. Still, the laughter did not end. It seemed to stretch on endlessly, as though the whole town had forgotten that auctions were meant for trade, not cruelty. Even those who said nothing were complicit, their silence joining the noise. Only a handful of women standing farther back looked at the Apache woman with sorrow in their eyes, but they did not step forward. Their sympathy remained hidden, unspoken, swallowed by the tide of laughter. The auctioneer wiped his brow and lifted his hammer again. His patience was running thin, though he still smiled for the crowd. "Gentlemen," he called out, "this is your chance. She will not be offered again. Look at her. She will survive longer than some of you think. Who will claim her? Who will prove himself bold?" His words were meant to taunt, to press pride into their hearts, but still the bids remained shallow. One man, clearly drunk, raised his hand and said he would give 2 coins and a broken saddle. The auctioneer laughed, pretending to consider the offer, and the crowd howled. Another said he would pay only if she promised not to speak, and the laughter grew again. Every word was designed to cut deeper, but still the woman stood in silence. The dust swirled at her feet as the hot wind carried voices across the square. The town's cruelty painted her as worthless, but she stood as living proof that their words did not define her. Each laugh was a test, and each second she endured without falling or breaking was her quiet victory. She was wounded but not broken. She was tired but not defeated. Yet the cruel game dragged on. The bids never rose beyond a handful of coins. The auctioneer called again and again, raising his voice, lowering it, changing his tone, but the pattern remained the same. Mockery, jeers, and pitiful offers. It was as if the whole town had agreed that her value was nothing more than the dust on their boots. Still, in the midst of that noise, there was a space that felt different, a pause that seemed to hang in the air. Some in the crowd grew restless, perhaps sensing that the moment was beginning to turn. They could not say why, but a strange feeling lingered, as though the laughter would not last forever. They did not know it yet, but a man was about to step into the square and change everything. For now, though, the woman remained the center of a cruel scene. The laughter had reached its highest point. The jeers were louder than ever, and the bids were still insults rather than offers. But just beyond the circle of noise, boots were already walking closer, steady and deliberate, carrying with them the weight of a decision that would silence them all. The laughter in the town square reached its highest pitch, echoing across the wooden storefronts and drifting down the dusty street. The auctioneer shouted for higher bids, his voice sharp and playful, but his words were drowned out by jeers and mocking offers. Men leaned on each other's shoulders, their hats tipped back as they howled with laughter. The Apache woman stood alone, her thin frame shaking slightly, but she did not bow. Her silence carried an unspoken strength, though the crowd refused to see it. And then, through the sea of noise, steady footsteps broke the rhythm. A cowboy moved closer, pushing through the crowd with calm patience. He wasn't dressed like the wealthier men who wore polished boots and bright vests. His clothes were plain, dusty from the road, and his hat had seen many miles under the sun. But his eyes were clear and steady, and the way he carried himself made people shift aside without realizing why. There was no rush in his step, no hesitation, only quiet determination. He reached the front of the crowd just as the auctioneer called out another bid, a pitiful number followed by cruel laughter. The cowboy's gaze did not wander to the people around him. He looked only at the woman on the stage. His expression did not change when he saw her wounds or her weary body. Where others saw weakness, he saw a person still standing despite everything. He saw dignity where the rest saw nothing but mockery. The auctioneer banged his hammer again. 4 coins! Is there no man among you with courage enough to pay more? His voice was loud, almost desperate to spark real bidding. Before the crowd could laugh again, a new voice cut through the noise. I'll pay 50. The words were calm, spoken without a hint of doubt. For a moment the square went silent. The laughter froze in the air and heads turned toward the cowboy. 50 coins was more than anyone had expected. It was far more than the jeers and jokes that had filled the air moments before. The auctioneer blinked, caught off guard. He had been expecting another cruel remark, not a serious offer that towered above the rest. The crowd erupted again, but this time it wasn't laughter alone. There were gasps, mutters, and confusion. Some men shook their heads in disbelief. 50 for her? One whispered to his neighbor. Has he lost his mind? Another muttered. The sound of disbelief spread quickly, rolling through the crowd like thunder. They had mocked the woman for being worthless, and now someone had placed a value on her that silenced their arrogance. The cowboy did not flinch under their stares. He kept his eyes on the auctioneer, his hand steady as he repeated, 50 coins. His voice carried a firmness that allowed no room for doubt. The auctioneer cleared his throat, trying to recover his control. 50, you say? He asked, pretending to sound unimpressed. Do I hear 55, 60? He looked desperately around the crowd, hoping someone else would raise the number, but no one moved. The earlier laughter had turned into uneasy silence. The men who had shouted insults now kept their eyes low. None of them wanted to challenge the cowboy's bid. The Apache woman slowly lifted her head. For the first time since the cruel spectacle began, she looked toward the man who had spoken. Her dark eyes met his steady gaze. She did not understand why he had spoken for her, but she could see that he was not mocking her. His offer had come not from cruelty but from something deeper, something the crowd could not understand. For a moment her chest rose with a breath that felt lighter than the ones before. The crowd broke into murmurs again, their voices quieter now, more cautious. Why would he do it? Someone whispered. She's wounded, she's nothing. Another man frowned, muttering that maybe the cowboy was simply a fool with too many coins. But deep down they knew it wasn't foolishness. There was a calm strength in the cowboy's manner that made their words sound hollow. The auctioneer lifted his hammer higher. 50 coins going once, he called, his voice trembling slightly. Going twice. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd one last time. But no one dared to speak. The cowboy's presence had silenced them all. Sold, the auctioneer declared, slamming his hammer against the stage. The sound cracked through the square, final and sharp. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Their laughter had been silenced, their pride unsettled. The man they had mocked for hours was no longer the joke. She was now the center of a moment they would never forget. And it was the cowboy who had written the ending to their cruel show. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dust as he approached the stage. The crowd parted silently, making room for him without being asked. He climbed onto the platform, his movements unhurried. The two men who had been holding the woman glanced at each other nervously, unsure of how to act. The cowboy removed his coat and draped it gently over the woman's shoulders. His gesture was simple, but in that moment, it carried more weight than the 50 coins he had paid. The woman looked up at him, her eyes shining with something between disbelief and relief. She had endured laughter, jeers, and humiliation, but now someone had given her back a piece of her dignity. She did not speak, but her silence was no longer heavy with shame. It was filled with quiet strength, matched by the calm presence of the cowboy beside her. The crowd could only watch. Some shifted uncomfortably, realizing how empty their laughter now felt. Others lowered their heads, ashamed. The air had changed. Where once it was filled with cruel amusement, now it was heavy with silence and respect they could not admit aloud. The cowboy turned to the auctioneer, dropped a small leather pouch of coins into his hand, and gave him a steady look that left no room for argument. Then he turned back to the woman and offered his hand. She hesitated for a moment, her wounded body uncertain, but then she reached for him. His grip was strong yet gentle, guiding her down from the stage. As they stepped off the platform, the silence deepened. No one dared to laugh anymore. The sound of their footsteps echoed louder than the jeers that had filled the square before. The townsfolk watched them walk away, their voices caught in their throats. The cruel entertainment they had once enjoyed had turned into a memory they would not be proud to carry. The cowboy did not look back. His focus was only on the woman at his side, making sure she did not stumble. Together they moved through the crowd, which parted silently to let them pass. Each step was a quiet statement, louder than any words could have been. The jeers had been silenced, and in their place was a truth the whole town could feel. Dignity could not be measured in coins, and cruelty would always be answered by courage. The square had fallen into an uneasy silence after the auctioneer's hammer struck the stage. Only the wind stirred the dust now, carrying with it the faint creak of wagons and the restless shifting of horses tied to posts nearby. The cowboy's bid had not just ended the auction, it had ended the laughter that had filled the air for so long. Where the townsfolk once leaned forward with smirks, they now stood back with uncertain eyes, their voices hushed as though afraid to break the quiet. The cowboy moved with quiet confidence as he wrapped his coat around the Apache woman's shoulders. The garment was worn and frayed at the edges, but it carried the warmth of kindness, a simple act that was more valuable than gold in that moment. For the woman, it was the first time that day she had been treated with dignity. She did not need to speak to show her gratitude. Her steady gaze toward the cowboy spoke more than words could. The auctioneer fumbled with the pouch of coins he had been handed. His earlier bravado was gone. He had shouted and joked with the crowd, enjoying their cruel laughter. But now his face had grown pale. 50 coins rested in his hand, heavy not just in weight but in meaning. He glanced at the crowd, hoping someone might join in with more laughter, but none did. No one wanted to meet his eyes. They had all been silenced by the cowboy's unexpected act. The cowboy extended his hand to the woman, steady and sure. She hesitated for only a breath, then took it, her fingers trembling but firm. He guided her down from the stage carefully, as though she were not weak or broken, but deserving of every ounce of respect he could give. Each step she took was slow, her body still weary from wounds, but beside him she no longer seemed small. Wrapped in his coat, walking by his side, she carried herself with more strength than before. The people in the square shifted uncomfortably. A few crossed their arms and looked away, ashamed of how they had laughed only moments earlier. Some whispered under their breath, trying to excuse themselves, saying they had only gone along with the crowd. But deep down, each one knew the truth. They had mocked someone who had already suffered enough. Now, with the cowboys' simple act of humanity, their cruelty was exposed for what it was. A mother in the back pulled her son closer. The boy's wide eyes followed the Apache woman as she walked past. He had seen the laughter, the jeers, and now the silence. In his young mind, the moment burned itself as a lesson. He would remember not the cruelty of the crowd, but the courage of one man who dared to act differently. The cowboy walked slowly, making sure the woman did not stumble. Every step he took with her was a quiet declaration that she was not worthless, not a joke, but a human being who deserved care. He did not look back at the crowd, though he could feel their eyes on him. He had no need to boast or prove himself further. His actions had already spoken louder than anything else could. The crowd parted as they moved through, but no one dared to speak. The earlier noise of laughter and insults had been replaced by the sound of boots on dust, the faint creak of leather, and the quiet breath of the wounded woman leaning slightly on the cowboy for balance. Each sound seemed louder in the silence, a reminder that the jeers had been silenced not by force but by dignity. When they reached the edge of the square, the cowboy paused for a moment. He adjusted the coat around her shoulders, tightening it so she would be warmer against the cool wind that swept in. The woman's eyes met his again, and for a brief second something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, respect, and a recognition that he had changed the course of her story. She had been brought to the stage as an object of ridicule, but he had carried her away with dignity. Behind them, the auctioneer cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to regain control of the scene. He called out half-heartedly that the auction was over, that the rest of the items would be sold another day. But his voice cracked and few listened. The crowd began to scatter slowly, each person lost in their own thoughts. The laughter they had shared now felt heavy, almost shameful. Some shook their heads as they walked away, while others muttered excuses, but none could erase the memory of how they had mocked someone who stood silently and endured it all. The cowboy did not care for their thoughts. He cared only for the woman beside him. As they stepped away from the square, he guided her toward a quieter path that led out of the noise and into open space. The sun was beginning to sink lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and gold. The air felt calmer here, as though the world itself was offering her a moment of peace after the storm of humiliation. For the Apache woman, each step away from the square was like shedding a heavy weight. She still carried her wounds, her exhaustion, and her sorrow, but she also carried something new, the knowledge that someone had seen her worth. She had been silent through the cruelty, but now, though she still did not speak, her silence was filled with strength rather than shame. The cowboy noticed the change in her. Her posture straightened little by little, her steps became steadier, and though her face was still marked by hardship, her eyes carried a spark that had not been there before. He offered her a water skin and she accepted it, drinking slowly, the cool liquid easing her throat. He did not ask her questions or press her to speak. He gave her the simple gift of time and space to recover, something no one else in that square had thought to give. Back in town, the memory of what had happened lingered. People would talk about it for weeks, perhaps even years. They would remember the laughter, yes, but they would remember even more the silence that came after the cowboy spoke his price. They would remember the way he wrapped his coat around her shoulders, the way he guided her away without needing to say a single boastful word. Some would feel shame, others would feel respect, but none would ever laugh at that moment again. The sun dipped lower and the cowboy and the woman walked on, their figures moving slowly against the fading light. The world around them grew quieter, the noises of the town falling behind them. It was as though they were walking not just away from a place, but away from the cruelty that had tried to define her. In its place, a new story was being written, one of dignity, compassion, and unexpected courage. The cowboy's act had silenced an entire town, but more importantly, it had restored something to the woman that no amount of cruelty could ever take again. She was no longer the subject of their laughter. She was no longer just a wounded figure on a stage. She was someone seen, someone valued, and someone who walked forward with her head held a little higher, wrapped in the coat of a man who had chosen kindness over cruelty. The town never forgot the silence that followed the cowboy's bid. For years, people would still talk about that day, not because of the auction itself, but because of how quickly laughter had been turned into shame. What had begun as a cruel game ended as a lesson that weighed on every heart that had been there. The faces of the crowd faded with time, but the image of the cowboy wrapping his coat around the wounded Apache woman stayed clear in memory, like a picture that could not be erased. As the cowboy guided her further away from the square, the evening sun stretched long shadows across the road. The air cooled with the coming night, and the noise of the market behind them grew faint. He walked beside her, steady and quiet, matching his steps to hers so she would not feel rushed. He did not speak many words, but the few he offered were gentle. "Steady now. Just a little farther," he said softly, adjusting his pace whenever she stumbled. His tone carried no pity, only respect, as though he believed in her strength even when her body was weak. The Apache woman, though tired, began to feel lighter with each step. The coat around her shoulders carried the warmth of kindness she had been denied for so long. For the first time that day, she felt the weight of cruel eyes lifting from her back. She had endured humiliation, but she was no longer standing alone. She had been purchased not as an object, but as a person given worth in a place where none had seen it before. Her silence remained, but it no longer carried the heaviness of shame. It was now filled with quiet pride, with the knowledge that dignity had been restored in the simplest of ways. Behind them, the townsfolk began to drift home. Many carried their baskets of goods, but their laughter did not return. The children who had peeked from behind their mothers now clung to them with wide eyes, whispering questions about what they had seen. Some parents tried to explain it away, saying the cowboy was a fool, but their voices lacked conviction. Others stayed silent, knowing deep down that what the cowboy had done was not foolishness but courage. The cruel jokes that had seemed so funny before now tasted bitter in their mouths. The auctioneer, standing alone on the stage with the empty pouch of coins, shifted uncomfortably. He had enjoyed the laughter earlier, had fed it with his own jokes, but now he felt small beneath the weight of silence. His hammer, which had once commanded the crowd, now felt heavy in his hand. He stuffed the coins into his pocket and quickly left the stage, hoping to escape the eyes of those who might remember that he had led the cruelty. Yet he knew he could not run from the memory of how a single cowboy had undone the spectacle he thought he controlled. Farther down the road, the cowboy stopped near a small stream that trickled softly between the rocks. He helped the woman sit on a fallen log, making sure she could rest. He filled a tin cup with cool water and handed it to her, waiting patiently as she drank. The sound of the stream, the rustle of leaves, and the quiet chirping of crickets filled the air. The world here was calmer, free from the harsh noise of the town. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, as though the breeze itself was washing away the weight of what had happened. The cowboy sat nearby, silent, but present. He did not press her with questions, did not demand thanks. He simply gave her space to be more than what the crowd had tried to make her. In his quiet way, he showed that respect did not need loud words. It needed only steady actions. The Apache woman glanced at him now and then, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. She had endured cruelty from so many, yet here was one who had chosen differently. That choice gave her strength more than any coin ever could. Night fell slowly, the sky deepening to shades of purple and blue, stars beginning to appear one by one. The cowboy built a small fire to keep them warm, its gentle glow casting light on their faces. The flames crackled softly and sparks floated into the air like tiny stars. The woman sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap while the cowboy tended the fire. For a long time neither spoke, but the silence between them was not heavy. It was peaceful. Back in town, people gathered in their homes, telling each other what they had witnessed. Some tried to laugh it off, saying the cowboy had wasted his money, but their voices shook with uncertainty. Others spoke with admiration, quietly admitting that his act had been noble. Parents whispered to their children that they should remember the lesson of that day. Never measure the worth of a person by laughter or coins. Slowly, the story began to spread beyond the square, carried from one household to another, until it became part of the town's memory. The next morning, when the cowboy and the woman returned to the road, the air felt different. The woman walked more steadily now, leaning less on his arm. She still carried her wounds, but her spirit seemed lighter, her steps firmer. She was no longer the same figure who had stood silently on the auction stage. She was a woman who had been given back her dignity, not by words of sympathy, but by the simple courage of a man who refused to laugh. As they passed the edge of the town, a few townsfolk who saw them did not jeer. They lowered their heads in quiet respect, some even moving aside to let them pass more easily. No one dared to mock anymore. The memory of the auction still hung heavy, and no one wanted to be reminded of their own cruelty. The silence that followed the cowboy wherever he went was stronger than any insult they could throw. The journey they took together stretched beyond that day, but the lesson remained clear. The Apache woman carried within her a renewed sense of worth. She had survived humiliation, but she had also witnessed kindness that had broken through it. The cowboy had reminded her, and the town as well, that humanity could not be measured by coins or mocked into nothingness. Every step they took together wrote a new ending to the story that had begun in cruelty. The town, too, changed slowly. The laughter that once came so easily at the expense of others did not rise as quickly again. When market days returned, people remembered that moment, and their voices grew quieter whenever they were tempted to jeer. Children who had seen the cowboy's act grew into adults who carried the memory with them, passing it down as a lesson of respect and courage. And though life moved on, that day remained a turning point etched into the heart of the town's history. For the cowboy and the Apache woman, their paths intertwined from that moment forward. He had not set out to change the town, nor to make himself a hero. He had simply seen a person where others had seen an object, and he had acted with compassion. That was enough to shift the weight of an entire square filled with laughter into silence. His coat around her shoulders, his steady hand guiding her, his quiet strength, these were the things that endured. And so the story of that day became more than just an auction. It became a reminder that dignity is not given by the crowd but upheld by courage. The townsfolk never laughed about that auction again. Whenever the tale was told, it always ended the same way, with a cowboy who paid more, not to own but to honor, and with a silence that shut down cruelty forever.